Good morning. It's really weird to be not only in the service, but up here in front of you guys. So before we started, I wanted to give you a little bit of a history behind this photo. So this photo was taken at GA, General Assembly in Kansas City, Missouri this summer that my family got to go to. And this is a picture of the Youth Caucus. So when you go to GA, Youth Caucus is a group that you can sign up for if you are 14 to 17 years old. And they have their own curriculum during the whole General Assembly. And so some workshops are led by adults that are meant for these caucus, and some of the workshops are actually facilitated by the Youth Caucus. And this picture is at one of the voting sessions where there was a vote to allow religious education professionals, such as myself, the right to vote, which is, sounds kind of weird. Because previously, before this year, if you were a religious educator at a church, you didn't have voting status at GA. And so the youth really rallied behind that because the youth recognized that in their home congregations, usually their religious education professional, whether it was a teacher or the religious education minister, was often the only adult that actually valued their opinions and advocated for them. And so the youth, this is them voting. They took turns speaking at the pro mic in favor of allowing religious education professionals to have the right to vote. And then I was just going to mention this little tree in the background here was kind of their symbol. So anywhere you went at GA, if you saw that little inflatable palm tree that Brinley loved and we got to take some pictures of, that kind of was their way of showing that they were there. And so even at the sessions where the youth weren't present, they would still set up their little inflatable palm trees so you could kind of remember that they were still there and they were still important even if they weren't physically there. So, since the creation of Unitarian Universalist Association in 1961, UUism has been a safe haven for people from a lot of backgrounds. Some people come here searching for a spiritual home, a place where they can ask questions, and not get answers, because UUs don't do that, and a place filled with unconditional acceptance. And for some people, and not all, some people come here because they might have been wounded by their religion of origin, and they need to find a place where they can heal those wounds and begin to have a better relationship with religion. Unitarian Universalism has been called a life-saving faith by a lot of people. For many, it is, but for others, specifically our children and youth, it can also be a place of rejection and a loss of spirituality. And that's kind of the heart of what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. As the religious educator in this church, advocating for the children and youth, I feel is the most important thing that I can do to you guys. So I know that usually we talk about quality over quantity, right? But for us to kind of all get in the same mindset, I'm going to throw some numbers at you guys. The amount of children that are raised UU that come back to the UU faith as adults is lower than any other mainstream religion. By comparison, 44% of Presbyterians, adults, were raised Presbyterian. 48% of United Church of Christ and the merger faiths before that. 50% of Episcopalians, and the biggest one is 67% of evangelical Lutherans were raised in that faith. Does anybody want to give a guess of how many adult UUs were raised as UU? Y'all shout it out. 10%? Okay, anybody else got a number? 14? Okay. Y'all are actually giving me some really close numbers. Somebody in the first service said 2%. But I think he told me he did that on purpose to make us sound better. So it's actually 12.5. 12.5% of children will grow up to be adult UUs. So if you can think of, we had about 19 kids up here earlier. You can do the math in your head. How many of those kids are going to, if the numbers stay the same, how many of them are going to grow up to be adult UUs? Oh, somebody actually had an answer. What was it? 1.5. So 1.5 of the children up here, if we don't change something. Some might be really quick to argue, and I've had people tell me this, that the reason that number is so low is because UU has such a high percentage of people that come to our religion from something else. And on the surface, you might think, yeah, that's true. But then when you actually really sit down and start looking at numbers, you will realize that that's not an adequate explanation of why our numbers are so low. So here's some more numbers. Between 1998 and 2009, there was an average of 150,000 adult UUs registered each year at UU churches. The annual growth rate during that time was about 1,100. So we grew 1,100 adults every year. During that same time, I skipped ahead. So 12.5% of that 1,100 would be 147. Okay, which should represent that would represent the number of kids raised as UUs that stay as adults. But during that time, the Young Adult and Campus Ministry Office at the UUA estimated that about 4,000 youth graduated from UU-RE programs every year. 4,000 is very different than 147. If we had the same retention rate as the Episcopalians, 50%, then we would expect to gain approximately 2,000 adults raised as UUs each year. So what that says is we have a lost growth rate of more than 1,800 people. If those numbers don't kind of make you sit back a little bit, they should. So now the question is, for me and other religious education professionals, is why are our youth leaving? How can we foster lifelong Unitarian Universalist faith that is meaningful enough for the kids that are all sitting up here to stay here and come back here as adults? So I'm going to talk about the 2005 Commission on Appraisal report, Engaging Our Theological Diversity. They surveyed and interviewed a bunch of UU churches throughout the nation, and they came up with 4 key reasons that retention rate is so low. And so I'm going to walk you through those 4 reasons and also make connections to our church about things that we are currently doing, things that we have done, and most importantly, things that we can continue to do in the future to help our children and young and youth. So number 1 that they identified was a general lack of religious identity and commitment. Just kind of like how I joked earlier about not getting answers. People in the UU faith have this really pretty idea that we want to avoid the evils of indoctrination. And so we spend a lot of time not telling our children what to believe. But unfortunately, UUs take that way too far. And our young people have little to no idea of what the UU faith is and what they believe. I wanted to mention one guy that talks about faith development. His name is James Fowler. Anybody that's got a background with psychology, or you guys have probably heard of him before. But he came up with the idea of stages of faith development. He believed that faith is a dynamic process that you engage in continually throughout your life. And as you have more meaningful experiences and opportunities, you gradually go through these 6 stages. So his stages tell us that young kids, like the ones we had up front, think very literal and very concrete. So they're going to get a lot of their religious experience through things that they actually do, through stories and things that they are told. They will look directly to their families first and their congregations second. So you guys, RE professionals, ministers, RE teachers, to find out what they believe and how they should be guided in their religious process. It's not until kids become teenagers and young adults that they can really start to see abstract concepts like philosophy, ethics, religion, spirituality, and that's when they really start to question. So while our adults are really, really worried about influencing our children, what we need to realize is that influencing them is one of the only ways that they will actually figure out what they believe. We have a saying in the RE world, the congregation is the curriculum. And I think that's a really important thing to think about, that working with our children and just in interacting with our children, they learn from you guys. And anybody that has kids, you know that. They're like little sponges. So if they're sitting down and they're having fun playing and they have an adult that turns to them and asks them about what they're doing, that's a connection. That's a positive connection in the church. But if they're sitting down playing and they have an adult that turns around and goes, shh, That's not a positive connection they're making with the people in this church. Working with our children, I always like to tell the RE teachers, it's not babysitting, it's not daycare, and it's not even teaching. It's ministering to our children and our youth. It's creating a meaningful religious and spiritual experience for everybody, not just the little people, the big people too. Number 2 that the commission came up with was there's a significant difference between the religious education classroom and the adult church. And right now, if any one of y'all were to go back there and look at what the kids are doing, you would see that stark contrast, okay? We're sitting here, we're listening to me lecture you. The kids aren't doing that. Right now, they're engaged in learning about sanctuary, and they're all creating stained glass artwork and talking about how the light enters in and sees things through different colors, and learning about what it means to be in a place of sanctuary. So the commission report said that the way we raise our UUs does not prepare them to be an adult UU. One of the things that I see is many adults see our children as noisy distractions, at worst. At best, they are cute little things that color, and then they come up front and they hear a story, and then we sing, please go away, so that they can go off and do their thing, and we can do important adulting stuff. That's a problem. That really is, because that's not preparing them to be adults in the church. And I also think we're doing ourselves a disservice. RE class is fun. If any of y'all have ever been back there, it's fun. So the idea that our kids need to be separate from us because they can't be in the church, that goes against our 7 principles directly. Children do have inherent worth and dignity as they currently are, not who they will and can be when they're old enough to give money and vote. Children deserve kindness and respect at all times. Children ought to be engaged in theological discussion. Okay, Fowler teaches us that even infants they can participate in faith development. Children have a right to ask all the adults in our congregation questions about religion and what they believe, and they deserve real answers. Children do have a voice, and they need a vote in what's going on here in the church. They deserve to have a fair and a peaceful community where people all come together and they cooperate and they solve through their problems and they work together. And our children are a vital part of the interdependent web of existence, and literally without our children in the church, we would cease to exist. So another thing I wanted to mention about the difference between religious education programs and the adult church is family. Actually, family structure has changed drastically over the last 80 years. In the 40s and 50s, all the churches, not just UUs, they realized that their numbers were dwindling, and they said, hey, we need to get all these baby boomers back in. So they created the Sunday school model, where adults come in, they go downstairs to the sanctuary, they do all their important adult stuff, the kids have to go upstairs, and they just play until it's time to go. The adults liked it because they got an hour free away from their kids. But what happened was these kids grew up with no connection to their families in a faith setting, no connection to the church as a community, and they had no reason to come back as adults. Generations of kids grew up and they left. They didn't come back because they didn't have any reason to. The commission, not just the commission, but religious education studies have found that there are 3 really important factors to faith development in not just UU kids, but all kids. Number 1 is the family. So say what you will about the Puritans, but man, they had religion at home like you wouldn't believe it, okay? You were raised in it. It was sun up to sundown, but those people, they had a connection with their faith. I'm not saying we need to be as extreme as them, but that's why we do things like family fellowship, because we recognize the importance that kids learn the most from their family about religion. Number 2 is whole congregational worship, or as we call it here, all ages worship. So that's one of the reasons we started all ages worship, because that's an extremely important part of connecting the kids with the church. And then number 3, behind those 2, is religious education. So I want you to think for a second about historically, where have churches placed the greatest importance on their kids? Is it family? Is it whole congregation worship? Or is it the RE room? Yeah. That's not to say the RE room is not important. In fact, they found that if a church has a healthy program in all three areas, then those children will thrive the most. But you have to have all three. And we're working really hard to build up the first and the second one here at this church. Speaking of history, number 3 that the commission came up with was a historical culture of focusing on transplant UUs as opposed to those who were raised in the faith. So another thing you can call them is the born-inners and the come-inners. Sorry. The born-inners and the come-inners, they have really, really different spiritual needs. For somebody like me who is a born-inner, because pretty much the only church I attended when I was a kid was a UU church. I visited other churches with my friends, but I consider myself a born-inner. A lot of times we kind of get left out at UU churches because the clergy is spending so much time catering to the very, very important spiritual needs of everybody in the room. And when you have 148 members like at our church who are come-inners, and then you have 2 people like me and Nell who are born-inners, who is going to get the most attention? Not me. So that's one reason that adult UUs don't stay is because they fall through the cracks and they don't get their spiritual needs met. And I wanted to share a short perspective that I have about being raised UU, and then I have a slightly different perspective from Chelsea. She wrote something up for me about more of a come-inner perspective. So I don't come to the UU church with a lot of the same experiences as you guys. And in some cases, some of y'all have a lot of baggage, like heavy emotional baggage and hurt from the faith that you were born in. But so instead of having to deal with that baggage and those questions when I was growing up, I had to deal with explaining myself to all of my friends because they didn't understand what I believed and what I did. But I think it actually was good for them because a lot of them didn't feel comfortable questioning their own faith, and so they would come to me and ask me questions because I could ask my RE teachers, why do they do this on Sundays? And they would tell me. And then I could go back and tell my friends, well, my teacher said that the reason that you guys do this is because of blah, blah, blah. And they'd be like, okay, cool. They didn't hear about it in their own church. Without a UU congregation to really help me understand not only what my faith was, but how to articulate it, I don't know if I would have been able to navigate some of the really, really tough situations I found myself in, not being a Christian in a really, really Christian place. Because I knew my principles and my values and my sources, I knew about the importance of religious pluralism a lot more than I think my peers did. And I was able to make my own decisions about what I stood for and how I wanted to be a UU. I did go through phases like a lot of you guys probably did where you would explore other religions. I remember exploring Catholicism and paganism and Buddhism and Hinduism and just finding it all fascinating. And when I was younger, I would say things like, okay, I am this. And I would read it. But then the more I'd read about it, I'd be like, I don't know if I totally agree with what this person is saying. And through that experience of reading about a lot of different religions, I kind of came to realize that no one religion had all the answers and that every single one of those religions together made up my belief system. All of those religions had something important to teach me, no matter what it was. And I think that by absorbing each of those lessons, I was better able to decide who I wanted to be as a whole person spiritually. So when we work all together, we can make that happen for our kids if we can help them explore those other religions. Chelsea is the other religious education teacher that we have here. She has the really, really long red hair. You probably see her up front hanging out with the kids like I do. She grew up mostly in Christian and Jewish churches, and so I asked her to write down a little experience that she had growing up as a kid, non-UU. And I would be willing to bet that some of you guys probably had a similar experience from her. So she says, as a child, I went to many different churches. In the past, I never found one that felt like home. In these churches, I always was sent to the child room after worship. We would play games and we would all have fun, but not once do I remember learning anything about God, Jesus, or Christianity. I'm not bashing these churches, I'm just telling it like I experienced it. Almost every Sunday, we would be told to go and play. Children's church was almost more like a daycare. If the church did not have a children's room, then we were forced to stay in the church with the adults. Notice how she said forced. Making noise of any kind would get us in trouble. Constantly moving and being a distraction would get us in trouble. Asking questions would get us in trouble. So eventually, she just didn't want to go to church because she was tired of getting in trouble. That was the model for every church that I went to until I was a teenager. That is when everything changed. I was finally old enough to stay in the adult church, but it was nothing to look forward to. When I was there, I would count the time until it was noon, and that meant we were finally done. I was expected to stay silent. I was expected to listen to the preacher. I was expected to understand what he was talking about, internalize it, and do what he says to do. I was expected to never ask questions because he was always right. Let me tell you that children's church did not prepare me for being an adult in church, as it should have. Building lifelong UUs is important for this fellowship to continue to grow and continue to thrive. If we demonstrate to the children these out-of-date practices, they will turn away from this place and remember going to church as I did. So a couple of different perspectives for you. Number 4 that the commission discovered through their interviews is that there was congregational challenges in accepting and encouraging raised UUs to be in positions of leadership and authority. So the churches that they interviewed had a problem with youth and young adults, raised UU, to be in power. The commission found that when youth reached about 14 or 15 years of age, that was the critical time that a church needed to include them in the community at large. And not just including them by letting them sit in the back and play on their phones, but actually including them in worship and the decision-making of the church and creating this fellowship together. So I would suggest that if people in this church are committed to bridging the generational gap that we kind of have in this church, is that we need to actively create situations where our youth and children and young adults can not only participate, but where they can succeed and excel. We're currently pretty small, I guess, if you compare it to like the mega churches, but we're growing. All these kids up here were young. Most of them were under 10, but no matter how much we try to stop it, they're going to be teenagers one day. And we have to have a place for them to be. One of the biggest things that I think our church can and should do is remove the age restriction on membership to be a member of this congregation. There is no law in Texas that prohibits a minor from being an active member of a church. There is no law that prohibits them from voting on any matter, including money. That's the thing I always hear. Well, they can't vote on money. Yes, they can. There is no law that prohibits a youth from serving on a board of a church. So why are we making our kids wait until they're 18 when so many of our children and our youth are already participating more than some of the adults? The children help in the nursery. They help in the kitchen. They help run the audiovisual equipment. They help create the PowerPoints that you guys see every Sunday. They help clean the church. Poor Liam has to clean a lot of toilets. Okay? They are already active members of this church, and we need to support that if we want to keep them here. At GA, I mentioned the picture earlier with the youth caucus. So we attended one of the workshops that the youth actually led, and the whole discussion was ways that they felt appreciated and included in their fellowships and congregations in ways that they did not feel appreciated and included. three biggest things that I pulled from that is that the youth, they feel included in their congregation and valued in their congregation when they are allowed to be part of the decision-making process of the church and when they are included in theological discussions. A lot of the social issues that the people in this room are very, very passionate about and that you guys do amazing work on, gun control, social media, healthcare, women's reproductive rights, education, those things, I would argue, actually affect our children and our youth more than they affect the adults who are working on them. So why do they not get to talk about that? Why do they not get a say? The kids, overall, all the kids at Youth Caucus said that they wanted to be talked with, not about. So when a kid comes up in the middle of a couple of adults talking, don't just hush up or push them away. Let them stand there. And if you're really talking about something that's super private or confidential that the kids shouldn't hear, you should probably take it in another room. Probably don't want to be talking about that in the middle of church anyway. As a congregation, we can support the UUs we already have by providing them with these opportunities. So I wanted to talk for a minute about what the UUA has done as a whole to help our children and youth. The UUA has created a lot of lifespan faith development curriculum, and they're really moving towards that. That's why a lot of churches, they no longer have children's RE and adult RE. They have lifespan RE because they recognize that religious education happens from the time you're born to the time you die, not just at certain points in your life. A lot of churches are moving away from the Sunday school model, the upstairs, downstairs model, and they're trying to do things like family worship and all congregational worship, things that are proven to support faith development in our children and youth. If you ever work back in our classrooms, we don't do a lot of lecturing. Which is what we're doing here. You know, that empty vessel of I'm the teacher and you will sit there and I will pour my knowledge into you. We don't do that in the RE rooms. We do hands-on learning. We do experiential learning. And things that are interactive so that they can not just hear, but they can learn and experience. At the AUUF, you will see kids, and I mentioned this earlier, they'll be involved in stuff, and we really, really encourage that. There's a lot of the kids that like to help with the babies, and we encourage them to do that. We don't just throw them in there. We give them skills. We teach them how to have a right relationship with a younger kid because we want to keep them both safe. But we encourage them that. They help with sound. They help, basically we just let them pick an area that they are passionate about, and we try to get them plugged in there with an adult in that area that's going to help them out. Using my own kid as an example, putting her on the spot, she helps with the audiovisual stuff, and she works really closely with Tad. And Tad is kind of her mentor in that area to help her out with stuff. And that's what we want to do for all of our kids. So we get to choose, as a church, as an individual, do we want to accept our children as they are and treat their presence as a present to the congregation? Or do we want to continue to put them away, neither to be seen or heard? Because they will be seen. They will also be heard. You will see them up front. They will fidget. They will cry. They will talk. They will giggle. They will do these things because they are children. And that's okay. If we don't want to accept them, then we're basically we're going to keep them from being in this life-affirming and life-saving faith that we should all be proud to be a part of. All right, thank you.